Good morning, afternoon, or evening, everybody, and welcome to Pangolin, the conservation podcast, the show dedicated to exploring and amplifying the world's underappreciated conservation stories. The stories that inspire me, and I hope will inspire you too. I'm your host, Jack Baker, and I am excited because it is the second episode of our Pangolin Pride celebration. This series, we are highlighting voices and stories from the LGBTQ+ community, and joining us to discuss their work today is the incredible, wonderful, brilliant, inspiring Susan Cheyne. Susan is the director of the Borneo Nature Foundation International and the vice chair of the IUCN section on small apes, and she's going to discuss the wonderful world of the singing, swinging ape. One of my favourites. The greatest ape that isn't a great ape. The gibbon. It's fantastic, it's wonderful, I'm so excited. She tells us why they sing, how their social groups function, and how we can help to protect them, and it's just brilliant, and I love it. And gibbons are one of my favourites, so I was so grateful we finally had somebody to talk about them, and to talk about them in such a brilliant, insightful, kind of storytelling way. It's just brilliant. It's just brilliant, brilliant, brilliant. We also discuss the importance of sharing our experiences within the conservation field, which is really, really important and interesting. And we talk about a really interesting article that Susan wrote to kind of start a conversation about her experiences being out and doing field work. So it's a really interesting insight into kind of that aspect of conservation and what it's like to do fieldwork as an LGBTQ+ person. And yeah, it's really, really interesting, and I'm so grateful for Susan being so open and talking about it. It's really, 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 really interesting, and I think you're all going to love it. Now, with all of that being said, I will not keep the wonderful Susan from you anymore, so without further ado, let's get started. Happy Pride! And welcome back to the show. I am now joined by Susan Cheyne, the co-director of the Borneo Nature Foundation International, whose work has revolved around amazing animals like orangutans, langurs, and of course, the wonderful world of gibbons, which we are going to talk probably mostly about today. But knowing the other things that you do, I may venture off track a little bit into some of those things. But thank you so much for joining me today, Susan.
Thank you for having me. I'm very excited to be here and always excited and happy to talk about gibbons and other animals as well.
Yes, I think it's a brilliant topic, and I'm so excited because yes, there's occasionally we talk about conservation projects, we talk about some episodes go all over the place in terms of the kind of things we discuss, whereas gibbons, I think, deserve fully their own episode and moment and star because they're brilliant and I love them, and I'm so excited to learn more. But before we do, I, of course, have given you a brief introduction there. However, I always think it's much better for somebody to introduce themselves because I know your name, I know what it says on your LinkedIn or on your website, but aside from that, I don't know very much about you yet. So I think, yes, would you like to introduce yourself to the listeners and tell them a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Absolutely, yes. Yes, so I'm Susan. I am originally from the west coast of Scotland, a wee place called Troon, which no one has heard of unless you're interested in golf. I suppose for my interests, I love rowing, paddleboarding, anything to do with the sea. I have 2 cats, may or may not join today. But with regard to work, yes, I've been working out now, goodness, in Indonesia for 22 years. So a wee while. But it's part of the work with Borneo Nature Foundation that's led on to another role that I have with the International Union for the Conservation of Nature Primate Specialist Group. We love our long names. So I'm the vice chair for the section on small apes, which are the gibbons. And that is really exciting and also a big learning curve for me because it involves working with people who work with gibbons across the world, obviously in the 11 countries where they live in Asia, but also rescue centres, zoos around the world. And additionally, I am a senior lecturer at Oxford Brookes University, where we have our MSc in primate conservation. So I have quite a few things to keep me busy. The nice thing is that they're all
Mhm.
quite varied. But yeah, being able to inspire students, go out and do the field work, and hopefully make a little bit of a difference for gibbons and all the other animals, and helping the people to help the
Mhm.
gibbons, which is a critical part of it. We can't do conservation without people.
I think, yeah, that's really, really interesting. And I think before we talk about the gibbons, I'll say I've heard of Troon because my mom is from Ayr, so my
Oh,
uncle now
right.
still lives in Troon, so I know where Troon is. I like as soon as you said it, I was like, I'm so look at me knowing I mean, the Scottish bias coming in of like yes, but no,
Yes.
that's brilliant. And yes, a local-ish connection via my mum, even though I've not spent much time in Ayr myself, and Troon myself. Um, but no, that's really, really interesting. And I think, yes, it has set up really interestingly kind of a lot of questions that I have for you, I guess, about conservation and protecting these things and how do we engage people and how do we kind of, yeah, because I don't know, talk about these things. Because I guess a lot of, what I think what's going to be really interesting is I think a lot of people when it comes to primates think they know everything about primates because they're ones that we see a lot in documentaries, we see a lot in kind of these things, but maybe people don't actually know the full story behind these things. And I think it's going to be really interesting to get into kind of the deeper story kind of behind the very charming animals that we all think we know a little bit about. And I guess to get us started, then we have to get us started. We've already started to, I guess, to kind of keep the ball rolling. Then I guess we've introduced you now, but of course, the other main character in this story is, of course, the gibbon. And so I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about that and a little bit about kind of what makes it special, what makes it unique, and yeah, tell us a little bit more about the wonderful world of gibbons.
The wonderful world of gibbons. I suppose perhaps people of a certain age might remember a band called the Goodies doing a song called The Funky Gibbon. I think this actually came out even before I was born. So I think maybe that sort of got gibbons a little bit into the public consciousness. But there's so much more that we know about them now. There are 20 species across 11 countries in Asia. And I think the most important thing for people to, there's many important things. They are apes, they're not monkeys. They're just a bit smaller than all the apes that people are very familiar with, like the gorilla, orangutan, chimpanzee, and bonobo. But they are apes, just like us. And I think the best way to describe them is they are the singing, swinging ape. They spend literally almost 99%, if not all of it, in the canopy. We know the other apes all come down to the ground, including orangutans. Gibbons don't, not unless forced. And the singing is the key thing. It's how, and they live in family groups, so it's how the family communicate. It's how the adults reestablish their pair bond in the morning and tell other gibbon groups that this is our patch of forest, don't come in. But these incredibly complicated species specific songs, they are complex, melodic, amazing. They've been called the opus of the primate world, and they're absolutely fantastic to listen to, and they're so important. Again, every single country where gibbons are found, where they would live naturally, has myths and legends and stories about gibbons, about them singing. And obviously, these countries are vast. Indonesia, India, China, just as examples. There's not just one story per country. There are multiple ones representing the different ethnic groups of people that live there. So gibbons are deeply embedded in culture in Southeast Asia. Here in the West, we've got Aesop's fables and the wily fox, the tortoise and the hare stories. Gibbons are like that out in Southeast Asia as well. But yes, the song is just, it's absolutely magical. even though
Mhm.
it tends to happen at 4:30 in the morning. It's
Mhm.
still magical to hear it.
I think it's one of my favorite things about gibbons. I think is this like so I as I said I work with the Royal Zoological Society of Scotland, and yes, there are buff cheek gibbons at Edinburgh Zoo. And there's something about getting there first thing in the morning before all the education classes start, before all the kind of people come in to see things, before everybody's there, and you're walking up through the car park and you can hear it from like the street, like even if beyond like there's buses going past or there's whatever down on the main road. But you're walking up when you get up through the car park, you can start to hear this beautiful, enchanting but kind of spooky, really interesting
Yes.
song. Really, really interesting song. I think that's really, really interesting. And I think it like there's the kind of interesting cultural aspect there, but then also the kind of social aspect which you kind of touched on between gibbons themselves. I think that's kind of it's really, really interesting. I think so. And I want to because I from my understanding, so like each gibbon group would have their own kind of version of the song. Is that correct? Like they'll each kind of have like the noises that they make will be distinct to them and their group, so they can kind of ward off other groups. Is that correct, or how did this kind of communication work between groups?
Yes. So I guess the easiest way to describe it is each of the 20 species have their own distinct identifiable calls, but within each species, the males and females have different calls. But then within that, there's very subtle differences. So obviously, each individual male and female, as we do as humans, has their own voice. And as humans, it's very we very rarely can we differentiate. We can differentiate between males and females. Sometimes we can identify individuals. Generally, we have to actually take, recordings and run them through computer programs to identify the difference. But yes, each gibbon has its own voice. I suppose maybe a way to describe it is you could probably, for example, tell someone has, say, a British accent, and then you could maybe narrow it down to, Scotland, or even, for us, narrow it down like to the west coast of Scotland. But each of us has our own voice. But we learn how to speak generally from our parents. So I know when I go home and people are listening to me and they say, "Oh, you sound just like your mum," and my brother sounds like my dad, because they were the people we learned to speak from. It's the same for gibbons. The young males will learn how to sing by copying their dad, and the young females will learn how to sing by copying their mum, but they each have their own individual voice. And that's what we are fairly certain they use, that once the subadults at about 7, 8 year olds leave the family group, it's this singing, which, as you say, travels very far, up to 2 kilometers, we think, at least. It's what they use to tell opposite sex gibbons that they are here, they're available, they're looking for a mate. And when they find that mate, then they will hopefully go off and establish their own territory and have a family. Dispersing gibbons from their home group is very difficult to study, so there's a lot we don't know about it, but that's basically what we think is happening.
Hmm. That's really interesting. That's really, really interesting. Um, and yeah, I guess like that's it. Also, kind of touches on these kind of behavioral dynamics of kind of the family group and structure and stuff as well. I don't know, is like so they are living in family groups, and then when they reach a certain age, will go off on their own. I said, like, is that kind of the how does that kind of family dynamic work? That's really interesting.
So once the sub-adult starts to get that bit older, to the stage where they're probably at dispersal age, if it's a young female, then the adult female will start to uh, encourage them to leave by sort of not letting them sleep in the same tree, perhaps not allowing them to spend as much time feeding in the same tree. So it's not aggressive, but gently encouraging the youngster to leave home. If it's a young male, then it tends to be the adult male that will do that. So gradually, the youngster will end up more and more on the edge of the group. And again, this is something that's poorly understood. Is it's not like bang, hit 8 o'clock, 8 o'clock. Sorry, 8 years old, gibbons leave. They can hang around in the family group, and there's multiple possible reasons for this. Maybe there's not enough space for them to disperse into. Maybe they are not leaving because they've started singing at that point, so they'll sing a little bit later than their parents so as to not compete. It could be they've just not heard another gibbon of the opposite sex that might encourage them to leave. Leaving home for a gibbon is complicated, and it's very difficult to study it, and we don't know a lot about it. A lot of it is very it's educated guesswork based on what we know about the gibbons. People have asked if we could put radio collars or microchips on them, and it's just not feasible to to catch an animal that spends its entire time up in the canopy completely wild. It's just not it's not an ethically viable option. So it means that we have to have boots on the ground trying to follow them. And it's very difficult because they can be there one day and you go back the next morning, even if they're very used to humans, and the subadult isn't there. And you've no
Mhm.
notion of where they've gone.
Yeah. That's really really interesting actually, and it kind of it leads on to a question that I had, and I think we've kind of touched on a couple things that I want to pick back up on in terms of like the cultural significance of these animals and things. And but something you've touched on there that I think is really interesting kind of brings me to a question I wanted to ask you is about kind of this, like obviously some people work with animals that they have. I feel like working with animals is always going to provide its challenges. With birds, they will fly away. With like things in the ocean, they will swim away. And I imagine working with these apes that disappear up trees in a thick canopy provides there's probably a lot of challenges there. And so it makes me want to ask kind of why gibbon if it, despite these challenges, why gibbons for you? What makes them worth these kind of struggles and challenges and kind of trying to overcome these things?
I think my answer now, having worked with them, is just they're not they're not well understood, and yet they play this critically important role in the ecosystems, as all species do. It's interconnected, but there's also this deep-seated cultural relevance of the gibbons across, as I said, across 11 different countries, and within those countries across multiple different ethnic groups of people. Written records are less common in many of these countries. A lot of the stories are oral traditions, and one of the projects I'm hoping to find funding for is to document all of these. But certainly with China, where there's a huge record of going back thousands of years, gibbons feature heavily in that, both in art and poetry. Sorry, drawings, art. I know art is poetry. Stories, and indeed, actually, an extinct species of gibbon was found in a very wealthy woman's tomb a few years ago. So culturally, hugely important. Why gibbons specifically for me? I, as part of my dad's job, he moved around a lot, and I spent some time growing up in Zambia, and I always knew I wanted to work in conservation with animals, and I always thought I'd end up going back to southern Africa to do something. And it wasn't until the summer between my third and fourth year of university, and there was an advert on the zoology notice board for volunteering opportunities at a gibbon rehabilitation project in Thailand. I thought, kind of interesting, that's fun. And I went, and a combination of, as you said, those enchanting, haunting calls, but also realizing just how much gibbons were suffering in the illegal wildlife trade and the photo prop trade, and that at the time rehabilitation for gibbons wasn't terribly well understood. They were A lot of what was being done was being based on what had been done for other species and not really accounting for the individual social and behavioral aspects of gibbons. And then the extremely non-scientific part as well is I just fell in love with them.
Mhm.
And I thought, they're so, nobody knows about a gibbon. I would tell people back home what I was doing, and just blank faces. I thought this poorly known, poorly understood species is being hammered by the pet trade, and rehabilitation possibly could work, but not in its current form. And that's when, somewhat naively, I decided that I was going to go out and do some sort of scientific study on the rehabilitation of gibbons from the pet trade and their release, and identify the challenges and barriers and things, and find out how it could be done better. And so that's what I did for my PhD. And a lot of what I came up with is still being used. Depressingly, there are far more gibbon rescue centres across Southeast Asia than when I started my PhD, because the problem is huge.
Yeah.
But happily, as part of one of the things that I can do as being, the coordinator for the section on small apes, I can bring these groups together. So the rescue centres are all talking to each other, they're sharing information, the vets are all working together so that we can start to look at some of the health and disease challenges facing gibbons coming into the rescue centres. But the pet trade is, I know you were asking why gibbons, but yes, I mean, I know we're talking about threats, but
Mhm.
the pet trade is huge,
Mhm.
and a massive, massive problem. But yes, basically, I think the short answer is I fell in love with gibbons, and I wanted to help.
I think that's a perfectly valid, because I always say like the show is called Pangolin after this kind of scaly, wonderful thing. And I think it was like, yeah, I learned its story during the pandemic when it was getting blamed for all sorts of things that weren't necessarily its fault.
Yep.
Um, and yeah, and it was these stories of like, and it was sometimes those emotive, sad things that you learn about these animals that make you realize, hang on, these are really special, wonderful, incredible things. And so they are the things that make you kind of, and aside from the sad things, they are incredibly charismatic and wonderful and interesting and important creatures. Like you want to kind of, so there's this kind of things. So I think falling in love with an animal and wanting to help it is a perfectly valid reason to want to do it. And I think it's a really good reason to want to do it. And I think, yeah, you've definitely managed to position yourself now in a place where you can, yes, as you say, link up all these things and really work to kind of help protect them. I guess like it does lead into that conversation about conservation and kind of the threats and things. And I suppose you kind of mentioned there the pet trade and these rehabilitation centers. Would you say kind of would you say the kind of pet trade is the kind of one of the major threat, or what are the other kind of major threats that our gibbons are facing at the moment?
That's a really good question. I suppose the pet trade is indicative of all the other problems. So to get a gibbon out of the forest, and it's young gibbons, they tend to be less than 2 years old, you have to kill the mother. And that means going into the forest and having access to the forest, and logging and extractive industry and large scale agriculture are all responsible for increasing access. But also, as part of the work we're doing, is trying to understand people's motivations for the sort of three main groups within the pet trade for gibbons. So there's those who hunt the gibbon and bring it to market. There's those then who sell it. And then there's those who want to buy. And again, looking across, a lot of this is now happening online, so on common social media platforms. The price of a young gibbon is relatively high, and this is a bit of a generalization, but it does put it in the bracket of those who have disposable income, which tends to be the sort of urban middle class. And this is, I'm talking now only about uh, uh, the illegal wildlife trade of gibbons within gibbon range countries. The illegal wildlife, international wildlife trade is obviously a problem and a separate issue with the gibbons crossing international borders. So, unfortunately, there is a lot of influence from the internet where people who have exotic animals as pets, primates as pets, primates make terrible pets. They should not be pets. Let me be very clear about that. In any country. So yes, the motivations, I suppose, are very different. It seems for the people who want to buy a gibbon, it's showing off. I can afford something nobody else can, even though gibbon ownership in every single country where they live is illegal. So I suppose it's sort of the tip of the iceberg, but ultimately, if we can protect the forests where the gibbons live, and they need, as I said, they're completely arboreal. They need no forest, no gibbon. It's very simple. Good forest, good habitat, good canopy connections, probably going to have gibbons. So if we can protect the forests, keep them active, keep the forest, sorry, intact, large enough to support viable populations, we'll stop that illegal trade in gibbons at source. But unfortunately, yes, there is a lot of perception that primates make acceptable pets. They don't. No species of primate does, or nor cats, big cats for that matter, wild cats. So yes, I suppose ultimately, if we can protect the forest, we can stop the trade. But we also have to work out and work with people so they're not selling gibbons, they're not hunting them, and especially they're not wanting to buy them. I know it sounds like a lot. It is a lot. All conservation, I think, has endless challenges, and it can seem, and even to me, it can seem overwhelming. But I think the important thing is that if you bring together enough people with enough ideas, you'll come up with enough different solutions to all the different problems. So, but as you said, falling in love, I suppose it's difficult to invest in something or care about something if you don't know about it. So, yes, I hope to help people learn about the fabulous singing, swinging apes. And yeah, go and see them in the wild where they belong, not in a bar or in a
Mhm.
circus, and definitely not as a pet.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's the thing, right? Is like, I think something I do now on social media is something that, like, and I would encourage other people to do is, I think things like Instagram and platforms like that now, because I look at a lot of animal content and I follow a lot of conservation charities that post photos, and I like photos of orangutans and gibbons and sun bears and all these things. Like, you see then Instagram or these social media platforms start to funnel content to you that's like, oh, well, this person has a gibbon that lives in their house, or this person has a serval, for example, that lives in their house, or this person has these animals. And you kind of, every time I see that now, and I know it probably makes very little difference, but I start reporting these things and going like, this is not a post I want to see, and these are the reasons why I don't want to see it. Because I think if you start these things, like, yeah, if you this is the thing, you want people to engage with nature and learn about nature and love nature, but you want to see it. And I recently did an episode with the chameleon specialist group, some members of the chameleon specialist group, and kind of was talking to them about the fact that, like, yeah, we need to see these animals as more than just props that sit on a shelf in a house or sit like nicely. They are so much more than that. And I think, yeah, trying to reframe and get people to engage and be educated and learn about them in the right way and see them in the right way. It's a real challenge, but it's really important, really, really important. Um, I guess, yeah. How do you go about then starting to, in your work, I guess, starting to like unpack some of these challenges and engage people and get them involved? Does it come back to, I guess, these cultural perceptions, or do you, like we were kind of talking about earlier on, that kind of they are important, or do they kind of, is it other groups of people you need to get, like there must, I mean, that's an impossible question because there's probably hundreds of different groups you need to engage, but yeah, where do you begin with all of this, I guess?
No, that's a really good question because ultimately we are trying to the needing, and it's
Mm,
not just with gibbons, everything trying to do everything everywhere all at once.
yeah.
And this is why I think, not just with Borneo Nature Foundation and our networks out there, but with the wider IUCN section on small apes, I think we're currently at nearly 340 sort of active people who are doing work with gibbons. Now that could be wild rescue centres or zoos outside of range state. I think our newsletter goes to nearly 1,000 people who could just, the newsletter is open to anyone. It's not specifically aimed at gibbon conservationists. So trying to get the message out that way, I think, using that network, because there's no way. I mean, this conservation can't be done by a single person. This network teamwork is critical. Sharing what we know, doing things like this, doing the podcasts, and benefiting from your networks as well. Going into schools, providing, doing talks in schools, or in Indonesia, our conservation club, where we talk to the kids about conservation, and obviously their local culture. We take them to the forest and engaging people almost in any way we possibly can. So on the 24th of October every year, it's International Gibbon Day. A theme this year is going to be gibbons as guardians. So we're going to be talking about, they spend all their time in the canopy. They are seed dispersers. They are born, they live, they create their families, and die in the canopy. That's Without that, there are no gibbons. So yes, look out for lots of social media posts leading up to the 24th of October. But I think it's constantly being aware, and social media again didn't exist when I started my PhD. So embracing that, and while social media is creating a lot of problems for conservation, as you say, people posting that they have got a pet primate and saying how wonderful it is when no, it's illegal. But social media can be enormously useful for good. So it's also embracing these different platforms for reaching out to people. And I think also the final bit is, I fundamentally believe that all of our conservation work has to be underpinned by good science. Because then if we know it works, great, we can carry on. If it's not working, we can go back and evaluate what we've done and figure out how to make it better. But we need to make that science accessible to the public. Whether that's the public in Indonesia or in Laos or Vietnam or the UK or whatever. So that public engagement is absolutely critical. And I fundamentally believe that is incredibly, incredibly important.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think that's the thing, right? Is this like, I think research is wonderful and brilliant, but if it's research that then sits kind of on a laptop in someone's office in a university for the rest of its existence, like it's still really interesting, but it's that getting that and translating it and making sure that as many people know, and as many people know these things is possible, as many people know these things as possible is really key, and making sure that people can have access to these stories and hear about these things. And yeah, I think is really, really, really important. Really, really important. And I guess, yes, puts not the pressure on the listeners. I'm not asking you to do anything, but after you listen to this and learn about gibbons a little bit more, I'm sure you've learned at least one or two things that you've been inspired by. Go, listeners, and go and tell people about how amazing they are, and go point them in the direction of resources and all of these things. Because yes, if you know, it then falls on you to help spread the message a little bit more and a little bit further. Yeah.
And we've got a very simple, easy website as well, which has all the links to there's a section for the experts. There's loads of stuff if you just want to learn about gibbons and listen to the calls. And it's just gibbons, www.gibbons.asia.
Easy to remember. That is the easy. And in case you can't remember it, listeners, I will put a link to it in the description of this episode, so you can go down and have a look, and you can click and go right there while we kind of finish our conversation and kind of talk about the last couple of things we're going to talk about. You can then go away and start looking at these things. I guess that is kind of bringing us towards, like, we've kind of talked about gibbons now, and there's a couple more questions I want to kind of ask you, just around other kind of topics and things that I like to ask everybody. But before we move away from the kind of gibbon kind of topic completely, I think one last thing that kind of came up, and I guess we didn't really. We talked about why gibbons are amazing. We talked about why they are culturally really important and kind of the significance of those things. We talked about the conservation things that kind of swirl around them, and some of the things that people can do to begin to kind of learn about gibbons, and but I guess the one thing that I haven't asked, and I think is really important, and you kind of touched on a little bit, is that they are seed dispersers. They are very important for the environments in which they live. And I think something that I'd like to just spend a second on before we move on from them is, why are gibbons so, like, just to really nail the point home, why are gibbons so important, and why should we care so much about them? Like, what is, like, like it would be good to talk a little bit about that, if that's okay.
So yeah, ecologically, the the majority of their diet is complex. They eat hundreds of different species and different bits of those species. But the majority of their diet is fruit. Now, when I say fruit, I don't necessarily always mean, nice juicy fruit. Fruit can be nuts, pulpy things, all sorts of other bits that they eat. But all of those ultimately contain seeds. And so gibbon territory size varies with the species and the habitat they live in. But, when they've eaten some fruit, goes into the digestive system and it'll come out the other end in a nice little pile of fertilizer. And that often, of course, is going to happen several hundred meters, if not kilometers away from the parent tree. And we've done studies on this where, yes, we have gone out and collected gibbon poo and we've looked through it for seeds, and we've identified that actually quite a few seeds pass intact through the gibbon's digestive system. So any of the chemicals on the outside of the seed that might be sort of protecting it are eaten away by the stomach acid, but the seed's intact. And again, it's now in this nice wee pile of fertilizer, and it's away from the parent tree, so it can grow. And we have, certainly, there are some species of fruit that the gibbons eat where they do chew up the seeds. That's fine. So you've got this constant daily gardening going on with all of these different gibbons. And within that, it's movement of seeds, it's dispersal of the seeds around the ecosystem. And I know there are other species that do this as well, but gibbons eat different things compared to an orangutan or a hornbill or a sun bear that also eats lots of fruit. They're also, because of their weight and because they're so arboreal, they can actually access quite a lot of things that many of these other larger bodied species can't access. Or even if a hornbill can access them because they can fly, a hornbill's beak is very different to a gibbon's jaw. So they do have that unique position within the seed dispersal community. They're also indicators of health of the forest, as all species are, but particularly a problem for peat swamp forest in Indonesia and Malaysia especially is that when it dries out because of human impacts, it burns. Crofters in Scotland are very familiar with burning peat, and we've had peat fires in the UK over the last couple of years when it's been very dry. Dry peat burns, and it burns and it burns, but it also produces a lot of very unpleasant smoke, which is often full of nasty things that nobody should be breathing in. And we notice a change in singing behavior, when there is these very thick palls of smoke over sometimes months. Lots of smoke around, everybody's coughing, human, animal, everybody. It's very unpleasant. The gibbons' singing is a fundamental, crucial part of their social and behavioral ecology. They need it to establish the family bonds. They need it to communicate with other species that this is their territory. So they have to sing, but we notice that they sing far less frequently and for far shorter periods of time when these heavy smokes are around. So that change in behavior, obviously we can see the smoke, but healthy gibbons means a healthy forest because they are utterly, utterly dependent on that forest. Equally, many species are not 100%, but very dependent upon them for dispersing their seeds. And we do know, again, that seeds dispersed and by gibbons, they will germinate better if they are dispersed in a little pile of gibbon fertilizer than if they are just randomly left on the forest floor. So, yes, ecologically, an incredibly important part of the forest, one of the biggest frugivores after, certainly in Malaysia and Indonesia, after the orangutan.
Mm-hmm. And I think that is a perfect point to kind of, end our or move towards the end of our kind of gibbon chat on, because I think, it's the perfect justification of, I always think it's weird though that we have to justify why animals are important, but that's a whole other podcast that we need to, but I'm like, it's a perfect justification for why like these animals are so wonderful and important and brilliant. Like I think it's like, and goes to show just how important they are to everything that lives around about them, not just in themselves. Like it's really interesting to think about these things. Really, really interesting. I guess that does kind of move us into our last couple questions that I like to ask everybody. And which is a shame because I wish it's always this thing where we have to move away from a species that I love. Like I'm kind of like, oh, well, but what if we talk for another hour about gibbons? But no, we need to be responsible and keep to time. And kind of move towards some of the other questions I have for you. And the first of those that I've been asking everybody this series because, as I kind of have said, this series is our Pride Month series. We're celebrating celebrating the fact that like conservation is done by an incredibly diverse group of people and needs an incredibly diverse group of people, as we've kind of been talking about, to be successful. And to the more perspectives we have and the kind of more people we have involved, the better kind of the nature and conservation and environmental education space is. But it doesn't always paint itself, I think, and it isn't always allowed to be, it's not always seen as a space that is inclusive and is able to be accessed by everybody. So the question I begin asking everybody this series is, what would you say to somebody who's listening to this who maybe thinks, oh, that's all good, that's interesting, but that's not necessarily the space for me, or I can't be involved, or I don't want to be involved? Like, how would you encourage people, or let them know that this is a space that they should kind of come into, and that we would like to have them here?
Yes. I think your point about different perspectives is absolutely critical for conservation. There is no one size fits all. And so to simply taking one approach, it's not going to work. You know, the first time that, and I think it was a female primatologist, actually went out and said, hang on a minute, ringtail lemurs are female dominated. At the time, it was mostly a male dominated field who couldn't conceive the idea that a group of primates might actually be led by the females and that the men were subordinate. Sorry, the males. But of course, now we recognize that this variation is abundant across the primate world and many other species. And, you know, that I suppose demonstrates that at that time, that narrow field of thinking based on a relatively small group of people that were doing this did the whole thing a disservice. I think often one of the barriers, particularly to primatology, is many of the countries in which we find primates are maybe not terribly LGBTQ plus friendly, or indeed, in fact, openly hostile. And that can put people off. And I completely understand that. It may not, in fact, be safe to go to some of these countries. Obviously, there are LGBTQ plus conservationists and other people from these countries that are living there and having to deal with this on a daily basis. I think, and it's not a simple answer, and if you want to do field work, I think it will be possible, but I do think especially universities, other organizations need to be more aware of the particular challenges that LGBTQ plus people might face doing field work. And I don't just include students, I include myself as a member of staff of the university, to be able to provide the best advice and indeed support as they should provide, if something goes wrong to anyone. But also, I think importantly, conservation doesn't need everyone running around the rainforest. It wouldn't work, actually, if we all spent our time doing that. We need people who can do modeling, statistics, mapping, policy, outreach and education, accountants. Good grief, we desperately need accountants. My NGO wouldn't run without our amazing accounting team. People in HR, fundraising, comms, graphic designer. These are all jobs that exist within my NGO, Borneo Nature Foundation. As we grew, we realized we can't simply continue to function as a bunch of people that run around the rainforest. Policy making, all sorts of different things mean that you can be involved in conservation without doing field work. If you do want to do field work, like I said, I don't have a clear answer for that. I did write a paper called Being Out in the Field, I think in 2019, good grief now, where I was trying to just bring to the light some of these challenges. I look at risk assessments standard risk assessment forms for students going to the field. And there's nothing there about, relatively little about sort of personal safety. And again, there's issues around that whereby you don't want someone to have to declare gender identity or sexuality on a piece of paper. But there should be something more available that says, okay, right, here are resources that you can access if you want. So there's a lot, I think, that still needs to be done within the conservation world relating to equality, diversity, and inclusivity. I think we're getting there, but I would absolutely say, please don't see it as a barrier. There are solutions, and there's always going to be something that is needed. Again, not all conservation needs and has to involve fieldwork. If fieldwork isn't your thing, LGBTQ plus or not, that's fine. You can still play an invaluable role in conservation.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think that's a brilliant message, and I think it's something that we don't. I think that's the thing we don't think about enough sometimes. Of kind of, I think people, I don't know, especially if we're in the UK, we sometimes forget that going abroad, that's not kind of, or going somewhere else, that's not the same experience here for people who live in the UK as it is for people all around the world. And I think that was a really nice kind of way of reminding us of those challenges, but also encouraging us to kind of go, well, there are workarounds and we can do this and there's things. And I'll put a link to the paper that you mentioned again in the description of the episode. If people want to read that, I'll try and find it somewhere that they can do that, and try and
Yes,
kind
I'm
of have a
fairly
read.
certain it's open access, so
Oh,
I can
mhm.
send it to you, but I'm fairly certain it's open access.
That's brilliant. That's really, really brilliant. Another thing that is good about, I feel like, is a whole other topic of discussion about getting people into academic reading and writing and thinking about these things, is the accessibility of things. So that's an excellent thing to hear. I really like that. That's brilliant. And it's funny, when you were talking about it, I've already thought of 2 or 3 people where I'm like, I'm going to send that. I'm going to read this, and then I'm going to send that to them because I think they would also appreciate something like this. So no, that's
I mean,
brilliant.
again, I don't pretend to know everything. It is very much
Mhm.
not only from a personal perspective, but also what I've learned from talking to other people. But again, you know, I can only talk about a little bit about my own sort of lived experience, but also from what other people have said to me. Obviously, no one's named. So, like I said, it's to start a conversation. It's not, that paper's not a solution or a be all and end all. It's really just, like I said, to get things started.
Mhm. And I think that's the thing, like, yeah, and I guess that's a good thing is once that ball is rolling, the more people who read it, the more people who think about it, the more people discuss it, hopefully change can start to happen. So that's really, really interesting, really, really interesting. Um, I guess that leads me to my final question of the day, which is, I ask everybody this because we are an underappreciated kind of animals and stories and plants and all these things podcast. And I know we've spent a little bit of time talking about the gibbon, but my final question that I like to ask everybody is, for people going away, once they've looked at gibbons, once they've thought about gibbons, once they've read your paper and kind of thought about these things as well, what is one underappreciated species that we haven't had a chance to talk about that you would like to shine a spotlight on briefly so people know about it and can go and learn more about it?
Okay, I've already know that it's the clouded leopard.
Excellent choice. 100%. Why the clouded leopard for you?
So I think a little bit like the gibbons, where everyone's like, is it a monkey? Is it an ape? The clouded leopard is either considered to be a small big cat, in which case it's put in with a category with like lions and tigers and also then attracts that level of funding, or it's considered to be a big small cat, in which case it's lumped in with all the other small ones and no
Mhm.
one actually cares about it. So it's, again, I seem to be attracted to these species that are somewhere in a little bit of a fence, depending on who you talk to. So again, beautiful, amazing, charismatic. They don't sing like gibbons, but they do have an amazing little sort of Prussian noise that they make. And I think relative to body size, they have the largest and strongest jaw of any cat. So they're like a modern day saber tooth. They don't have the big long teeth, but muscle structure, etc. They're arboreal. They come to the ground. They're just wonderful. So it would have to be the clouded leopard.
I think that is a stellar, stellar, stellar choice. And I think the problem with asking this question is not the good thing and problem with it is I now, every time I ask it, somebody brings up something where I'm like, I now want to do a whole episode about that. So I've got like the list is just growing and growing and growing of like people bringing up like weird little penguins or narwhals or all of these things that like they're like, oh, you should do this. Now the clouded leopard has I've been reminded of and is now firmly on that list of things that I need to do an episode about because that is
Excellent.
absolutely a brilliant choice. No, that's fantastic. That is absolutely fantastic. And I think, yes, really rounds out an episode which was already stellar in its lineup with Gibbons into something even stronger. And I guess, unfortunately, having said that and having asked that final question, that does bring us towards the end. As I said a little bit earlier, I will put links to all of the things we've talked about in the description of this episode, all of the kind of social media and websites and papers and stuff that we've chatted about will all be down there. And I'll also put links to all of our social media down there. So if you're on X or Instagram or wherever it is anyway, we're at Pangolin Podcast on everything. And you can also subscribe to the podcast wherever you are listening now, and leave us a nice review if you're so inclined as well. And having said all of that, I think the final thing that I have to say this episode is, of course, a huge thank you to the listeners for tuning in and listening. And I hope you've really enjoyed. I know you will have because I've loved every second of talking today. And of course, a huge thank you to you, Susan. It's been absolutely brilliant to learn all about your work, all about the wonderful kind of world of the gibbons, learn more about their song and their social structure and all of these things. It's just been absolutely fantastic. So thank you so much for your time today.
No, thank you so much for reaching out and thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure to talk about gibbons, and I really hope people have enjoyed. And like I said, listen to them. Yeah, join the singing, swinging ape club, and I just go and learn about clouded leopards and pangolins and everything else. And yes, as Jack said, listen to all the podcasts.
Yes, we're almost at 100 now, so it's not like you've got a big task in front of you if you want to listen to them all. No, that's brilliant. Thank you so much. And yes, I guess on that note, thank you all again for listening, and until next time, goodbye.
Bye.